My name is Katerina, I'm 21 years old, and I come from a mix of places, though right now I'm living in Langley Park, Maryland, with my boyfriend. I've been watching your videos for as long as I can remember, and I absolutely love your voice. It helps me fall asleep most nights, but I've always hoped I'd never have a reason to write to you. I used to think it was a bit tacky and voyeuristic, but then I read a story from someone else, and I guess it serves as a kind of therapy. If it weren't for their awful experiences and the fact they took the time to write them down, I wouldn't have gotten to hear all the stories I have. That's why, although it made me feel guilty for enjoying your channel so much, I also hoped I'd never go through something similar. Well, I did, and now I'm sending this in. I'm studying at the University of Maryland, and my course is pretty unconventional, though that's not really relevant to the story. The important thing is that I made my decision at the last minute, and I didn't get my first choice of housing. I knew I'd have to live with a roommate, and while the university guaranteed she'd be female, I had no idea if we'd get along. I actually prayed my roommate would be a good match, and when I first met Aubrey, I was relieved. She had strawberry blonde hair, bright brown eyes, and it was obvious from her clothes and stuff that her favorite color was pink. The first thing I said to her was, "Oh my God, pink is my favorite color too." When she squealed and hugged me, I just knew we'd be best friends. Aubrey was incredibly kind and asked me about my background. She even said she loved my accent, which is a bit messed up, and that made me feel really welcomed. Living with Aubrey was just as much fun as I imagined. Though she loved to party, she made sure our apartment was a peaceful place to study and unwind. She was fun, and unlike a lot of other college girls, she was more focused on academics than socializing, which was exactly the lifestyle I was hoping for. Still, after a long week, we needed to relax, so every Friday or Saturday, depending on when we were both free, we'd grab a bottle of wine and act like wine moms while watching Gilmore Girls or Grey's Anatomy. It became a regular thing, but we always had to work around Aubrey's weekend dates with her boyfriend. Aubrey's boyfriend, Nick, seemed like a really nice guy, which wasn't surprising because Aubrey had this sweet vibe about her. He was just as nice to me as he was to her. I felt really lucky to be living with someone so great. I'd heard horror stories about roommates making life miserable for each other, but I genuinely thought I'd avoided that, until I realized that moving into that campus apartment would make me the star of my own horror story. So, Aubrey and I had our regular wine mom nights, and at least every 2 weeks, we'd decide to start watching Only Murders in the Building. I was so excited to get tipsy and watch a couple of episodes with her. We'd talked about it all week, and Aubrey seemed super up for it, but then, just a few hours before we were supposed to start, she told me some bad news. Her boyfriend's schedule had changed, and he'd be away the following weekend, so they were either going to have their date night that evening or not see each other for 2 weeks. I understood, so I told her to go ahead and see Nick, and we could watch the show another time. She thanked me, hugged me, and ran off to get ready for her date. Aubrey said Nick was picking her up at 7, so around 6:30, I ordered some sushi from a good place off campus, figuring I could eat something light before I started drinking. At around 7 o'clock, Aubrey told me Nick was running a little late, so we each had a small glass of wine before he called to say he was outside. She hugged me again, told me to enjoy whatever I was watching, and left for what I assumed would be the night. I finished my first glass of wine and went back into the kitchen to pour another. I'd eaten maybe half of my sushi platter, so I was ready for more. After pouring myself another glass, I went back to watch more Gilmore Girls, tipsily singing along with the theme song in a way I'm glad no one saw. I finished that first glass while watching Rory stress over her Yale application and then poured myself another. But just a few sips into the third glass, I started to feel really nauseous. I thought maybe it was the sushi not mixing well with the wine, so I figured I'd just slow down and wait for the feeling to pass. But it didn't. I felt worse, way worse, and not just nauseous but dizzy and shaky too. I wondered if I'd eaten bad sushi or if I was reacting poorly to the wine, but I'd had that happen before with other foods. So I decided to make myself puke. Not glamorous, but it worked before, and I figured it would help. After throwing up a ton of half-digested sushi and wine, I felt a little better but still extremely tired. I decided to take a nap for a couple of hours, hoping I'd feel better when I woke up. When I woke up, I looked at my phone and it was 10:03 p.m. I planned to take a quick 20-minute nap, but then heard voices outside in the hallway. It was Aubrey and Nick, and instead of heading to the kitchen or TV room, they stopped outside my door and started whispering. At first, I didn't think much of it. I assumed they had a good reason to be quiet. But then I heard them speaking, and it made me feel sick in a different way. Nick asked Aubrey if she was sure, asking repeatedly, "Are you sure? Are you sure though?" Aubrey responded, saying, "Yes, I'm sure. She was drinking when I left, and half the bottle is gone now." It took me a second to realize what they were talking about, but when I did, I felt a horrible sense of dread. Nick asked her if she put something in the bottle, and Aubrey said yes. She then assured him I would be passed out, that I wouldn't wake up, and if they did it right, no one would ever know. That's when it hit me. They had drugged me. I couldn't believe it. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare. They continued talking, and I eventually heard them say, "I love you" to each other, and Nick's deep voice responded, "I love you too." Then, the door handle to my room started to turn. I was too stunned to move but just watched as the door opened. It was still dark, so they didn't see me sitting up. Nick asked, "Should I turn the light on?" And when he did, they froze when they saw I was awake. There were tears in my eyes from the betrayal, the deception, the predator behavior. It was gut-wrenching. Aubrey tried to act normal, but I knew she hadn't expected me to be awake. She said they just wanted to check on me because it wasn't like me to go to bed early, and she wanted to make sure I was okay. I told her I was fine, just tired, and wanted to be left alone. I wanted to confront them, but I knew that would put me in danger. I had to pretend everything was fine for my safety. After she left, I stayed under the covers, my hand over my mouth, trying not to let them hear me cry. I was young, naive, and scared for my life. I didn't call the cops right then because I knew it would take too long. Instead, I called my current boyfriend, who I trusted enough to ask for help, even though I didn't want to tell him what I suspected. I just told him it was an emergency. He picked me up, and I stayed with him that night without him knowing the full extent of what had happened. It wasn't until I called the cops later and told them I thought my roommate and her boyfriend had drugged me that my boyfriend realized what was going on. The dispatcher recommended I go to the hospital, but I didn't think it was necessary. I'd already purged most of whatever they gave me. The dispatcher then asked me to meet the cops at the apartment. When we arrived, Aubrey and Nick were gone, and so was the bottle of wine. The cops were interested in getting their hands on it, but they had been careful to take it with them. The cops told me the chances of the case going to trial were slim without solid evidence, like the bottle or surveillance footage. They advised me to get out of there, pack my things, and never associate with Aubrey again. I was horrified. The cops searched her room and Nick's, but they found nothing. I later learned that they'd probably removed all evidence of what they'd done, which was even scarier. Aubrey didn't come back to campus that year. I haven't seen her, so I'm assuming she dropped out. If that's true, I can say with certainty that the campus is a much safer place without her and Nick around. When I was 23, I had to relocate out of state for work. I still work with the same company, but I was fortunate enough to move back to my hometown and work in the local office. At the time, I needed affordable housing, so I posted an ad looking for a roommate on nearly every website: Facebook, Craigslist, Twitter, and even my neighborhood subreddit. A guy named Rob responded on Facebook, saying he had a room available. I checked out the pictures and he seemed like a normal guy, so I decided to give it a shot. I was open to having a male roommate, as long as they seemed like a decent person, although my parents strongly opposed the idea. Rob and I had a FaceTime call, during which he gave me a virtual tour of the house. He claimed to own the place outright. It was a modest house in the middle of town, only a 10-minute drive from my office. He seemed pretty nice, and I didn't get any strange vibes. The price was reasonable, and the rules seemed fair too. He told me the room was available immediately, which worked perfectly for me. So, I packed up my things, and a week later, I drove down to meet him. When I arrived, Rob greeted me out front and handed me a key. The first thing I noticed about him was that he was quite short, about the same height as me. He helped me carry in some of the heavier bags, then showed me my room, which was already furnished. He explained that one of his friends had lived there but recently moved out. I replaced the pillows and bed sheets with my own, of course. That day was mostly spent settling in. Rob seemed to be trying to get to know me and make me feel at home, but nothing felt overly friendly. The next day, a Sunday, Rob offered to drive me around town to show me the area. I wasn't too keen, but I agreed, wanting to make a good first impression. He showed me the shopping centers, restaurants, and local spots. Then he suggested we grab lunch. I wasn't hungry, but he insisted on a sit-down meal, almost like it was a date. I didn't want him to get the wrong idea, so I said I wasn't hungry. He then offered to grab drinks instead, but I politely declined, saying I don't drink on work nights. He kept pushing, saying, "Just a couple drinks." I turned him down again. He grew quiet, almost upset. I was a bit uncomfortable but tried to brush it off. The next few days were my first week at work, so I was focused on adjusting to the new routine. It wasn't until a few days later that I did my laundry and noticed something odd. My hamper of clothes seemed to have been moved around, and when I went to load the washing machine, I realized a pair of my underwear was missing. I checked my room thoroughly, but it was gone. The thought crossed my mind, could Rob have taken them? I refused to believe it, but I couldn't shake the thought. I didn't want to confront him, though. At that point, I really wished I had a lock on my bedroom door. That weekend, I bought a lockable doorknob from Ace Hardware and swapped out the one on my door while Rob wasn't home. Now I could leave my room in peace. I planned to tell Rob about it the next time I saw him. He didn't come home that night, so I figured he must have been working. Late that night, I woke up to loud knocking on my bedroom door. It was Rob, sounding upset. It was about 1:30 a.m., and I was terrified. I decided to pretend I was asleep. I had a feeling it was about the doorknob, and I was right. The next morning, I had several texts from Rob saying we needed to talk after work. I responded, asking if it was about the doorknob. He confirmed it was. I apologized, explaining that I had just felt safer having privacy in my room. He responded a little nicer but still insisted the old doorknob had to go back. I was confused and upset, but I felt I had to respect his rules. After all, I had changed the doorknob without telling him. I was also puzzled about how he knew I'd changed it. The thought that he might have tried to enter my room that night scared me. I changed the doorknob back the next day and returned it to Ace, but things took a darker turn shortly after. One afternoon, while Rob wasn't home, there was a knock at the door. A girl around my age stood there. She asked if I lived with Rob, and I said yes. She immediately warned me to leave as soon as possible. Apparently, Rob had multiple restraining orders against him from different women and was known to be a creepy, dangerous stalker. I was stunned. She explained that she knew he was trying to rent out his room and wasn't surprised when he picked a woman. She'd seen me moving in and wanted to warn me once she knew Rob wasn't around. I thanked her profusely and took her number, terrified but grateful. I started packing my things and found a new place across town, a studio apartment, albeit a little more expensive. The woman who'd warned me was kind enough to help facilitate my quick move. I then texted Rob, telling him I had to move out the next day due to a family emergency. He didn't respond right away. When he got home, he asked me about the message. I came up with a story, and he said he'd give me my money back the next day after going to the bank. I was relieved. About an hour later, Rob knocked on my door again. He asked if some girl had said anything to me. I told him, "No, what do you mean?" He seemed to drop the subject, saying it just felt like I was running away for another reason. I insisted it was due to family issues. He let it go, and I thought I was in the clear. That night, I woke up to a terrifying sight, a dark figure sitting at the end of my bed. It was Rob. He turned around and put his hand over my mouth, whispering, "Shoo!" I froze. He then said, "Why would I hurt you? I know someone told you things. Don't listen to them." I was paralyzed with fear. I whispered, "You're scaring me," and he started to caress my leg, saying, "I didn't mean to scare you." It was the most unsettling moment of my life. I managed to get up and ran for the door. Rob screamed at me to stop, but I didn't. I ran outside and called the police. I hid in the bushes until they arrived. I explained everything to the officers. They made Rob come outside, and he gave his side of the story. The police were there while I collected my things and loaded them into my car. I also insisted that Rob return my money, and he did. The entire time, he tried to act like a normal guy, but one officer pulled me aside and told me Rob had a history of getting arrested for similar incidents with women. Rob denied ever entering my room or touching me, but it was his word against mine. I left the house, spent the night at a hotel, and the next day moved into the studio apartment. The woman who posted the ad helped me settle in quickly. I vowed I would never again live with any man who wasn't my boyfriend or husband, or anyone I didn't know well. It was my junior year of college. I had moved off campus into a student apartment building. My roommate was assigned to me by the school as someone else who needed someone to live with. His name was David, and he seemed like a nice guy at first. He was friendly and polite, always smiling and making small talk. But as the days went by, I started to notice strange things about him, little quirks and odd behaviors that made me feel uneasy. It started with the way David would always linger in my room, asking pushy questions about my personal life and poking around my belongings as if he were way too comfortable doing so. At first, I brushed it off as harmless curiosity, even if I found it kind of weird. But the more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. Then there were the sounds I would hear coming from David's room late at night, talking and shuffling noises that were slightly concerning. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was just David watching TV or talking on the phone. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One night, unable to sleep because of the strange noises coming from David's room, I decided to investigate. I crept silently down the hallway and pressed my ear against David's door, straining to hear what was going on inside. What I heard was just weird. It was the sound of David whispering to himself, his voice low and muffled. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped, and there was nothing but silence. Then I heard, "Jeff." David said my name. Did he somehow know I was outside his door? I quickly and quietly tiptoed away from his door, and back to my room. I silently crawled back into my bed. I didn't know what to make of this. Why was David talking to himself? Was he hiding something from me? Or was he sleepwalking? But then, how did he know I was outside of his room? I couldn't shake the feeling of uneasiness. The next day, I kept thinking about the night before. As the days went by and the sounds from David's room persisted, my paranoia only grew worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that David was hiding something from me. David's behavior also became stranger. I started to notice little subtle changes, like the way he would make strange glances at me, and his movements seemed a little furtive. One night, I woke up at some odd hour and heard David's whispering voice outside in the hallway, like right outside my door. It was genuinely freaking me out, and I wondered if he was sleepwalking. I went to the door and put my ear up against it, and like last time, the whispering stopped. Then David once again said, "Jeff?" This time I replied and said, "Yeah, you good?" He didn't respond. I just heard his footsteps walk away to his room. The following night, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door closing. I heard David's footsteps walking away in the hallway. This was getting out of hand. The next day, I decided to confront him about his potential sleepwalking. I told him I'd been hearing him walking around late at night and that I heard him close my door last night. I then asked him if he had ever been known to sleepwalk or have any kind of sleeping disorders. He seemed to not know how to answer at first, but then he said yes, he does tend to sleepwalk sometimes. I wasn't buying it though. Something was up. I decided to search David's room for answers. I knew it was risky, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. I waited until David was out of the apartment, then I crept into his room. I knew that I might not have much time, so I searched quickly, tearing through drawers and closets in search of anything that might explain David's strange behavior. And then, just as I was about to give up, I found it, a small, nondescript drawer hidden at the back of David's closet. I pulled it open, and my blood ran cold at what I found inside. It was a collection of photographs, dozens of them, mostly featuring me asleep, and one other guy who looked to be our age, all mixed together. They were taken from different angles and distances, some of them so close up that I could see the pores on my skin and individual strands of hair on my head. I felt sick to my stomach as I realized what I was looking at. David had been secretly taking pictures of me while I slept, without my knowledge or consent. I couldn't believe it. I had been living with some kind of sick voyeur who had been violating my privacy and invading my personal space for who knows how long. I wanted to confront David to demand answers, but I was afraid of what he might do. Afraid of what he might say. Afraid of what might happen if I confronted him alone. So, I took a picture of the contents of the drawer and then took a handful of the photos as evidence to use against David. I packed my things, and the next day, I showed the photos to the department in charge of student housing accommodations. They told me to let them take the appropriate action. I was lucky and got assigned to a different apartment with a normal person who needed a roommate. I never spoke to David again. Even now, years later, I still can't shake the memory of those chilling photographs and David's whispering and creeping around at night. I never found out who the other guy in the photos was. It was definitely his old roommate, but I was never able to find his name. But who knows, maybe he also found out. When things fell apart with my parents, I had no choice but to move out. Life wasn't easy. My living situation was dire. I could only stay on friends' couches for so long before it became unsustainable. I began scouring roommate and apartment apps and websites, hoping to find a solution. Eventually, I came across a listing that piqued my interest. A man named Luke had posted an ad for a room in his single-story, 3-bedroom house. The rent was $1,200 per month, which was a decent deal for the area. Essentially, Luke would be both my landlord and roommate since he also lived in the house. In his post, he emphasized that he would rarely be home, meaning the renter would often have the place to themselves. However, he also laid out some ground rules in all caps. No parties, no large gatherings, no drinking in the living room, and absolutely no access to the basement. The rules seemed pretty standard. I scheduled a viewing to see the house in person and meet Luke. The moment he opened the door, I got the impression that he was introverted. He had a quiet, slightly awkward demeanor. As he showed me around, I noticed his voice trembled, and he stuttered occasionally. The room for rent was a good size, and the house itself had a great open layout, with the kitchen, dining room, and living room all blending into one large space. For $1,200 a month in my area, it felt like a steal. Luke reiterated the rules in person, especially about staying out of the attic and basement, which he said were used strictly for storage. It all seemed fair, so I expressed my interest. We shook hands, and 2 days later, I moved in. There wasn't any formal lease or contract. I simply agreed to pay him off the books at the beginning of each month. Settling in was easy since the room was already furnished. I just added a few personal touches, like hanging decorations and filling the dresser and closet with my clothes. The room even had a lock, and Luke gave me a key to it so I could secure it when I wasn't home. Initially, I thought that was considerate. Luke never shared what he did for work, only mentioning he'd rarely be around. But I quickly noticed that wasn't the case. His car was almost always parked in the driveway when I got home from work. Soon, I began hearing noises late at night, footsteps, doors opening and closing repeatedly. One night, around 2 a.m., I left my room to use the bathroom and noticed the basement door was open. Curious, I walked over to peek down the stairs. A faint light was glowing from a corner out of view, and I could hear banging noises coming from below. Then, the noises stopped. Suddenly, Luke appeared at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at me. His expression was hard to describe, cold and unsettling. He seemed irritated and told me sharply to close the basement door. Feeling uneasy, I apologized and complied, heading back to my room. I couldn't sleep that night, my mind racing with questions about what he was doing down there. About a week later, I came home and found my bedroom door unlocked. I always locked it before leaving, so this alarmed me. Nothing seemed to be missing, but some items had clearly been moved. My clothes in the dresser weren't as neatly stacked, and the closet door was slightly ajar. Realizing Luke likely had a key and had gone through my things felt like a huge violation of trust. I decided to confront him and knocked on his bedroom door. Despite his car being outside, there was no response. Frustrated, I gave up and went back to my room. Later that evening, while I was relaxing and watching TV, I heard his door open. I quickly got up and went to the living room to catch him as he was leaving. When I asked if he'd been in my room, he denied it with a blank stare, claiming I was the only one with a key. Before I could press him further, he said he was in a hurry and left. His evasiveness only made me more suspicious. After he left, I realized it was my first chance to explore the basement without him around. I checked to ensure his car was gone, then opened the basement door. Oddly, I couldn't find a light switch, so I used my phone's flashlight. The stairs creaked loudly as I descended. The basement was small, with a poorly fitted tan carpet that curled at the edges. In the center of the room sat an old, ugly couch, and the air smelled foul. The stench grew worse as I approached a locked door in the corner. It reeked of something like raw sewage, but worse. I decided against trying to open it. I scanned the main room briefly but found nothing of interest aside from some taped-up cardboard boxes, which I didn't dare touch. Feeling unnerved, I quickly returned upstairs and shut the door. That night, I stayed locked in my room. At some point, I woke up in the dark, not to my alarm but to the sound of the floor creaking beside my bed. Turning, I saw Luke leaning over me, staring. Terrified, I screamed, and he hissed at me to be quiet, asking if I had gone into the basement. I denied it, demanding to know how he got into my locked room. He ignored my question, instead asking again if I had been in the basement. When I repeated my denial, he turned to leave. I noticed him raise his hand, showing it to me in the darkness, though it held nothing. As he walked out, he said ominously, "I think you should find somewhere else to live." As soon as he left, I started packing. I couldn't stay another second in that house. I pounded on his door, demanding a partial refund since I'd only been there for 2 weeks. Moments later, his hand emerged from the doorway, holding a stack of bills. The way he handed me the money was just as unsettling as everything else about him. It was $400, not quite what I wanted, but enough for me to leave. I packed everything and was out within an hour, sleeping in my car that night. The next day, I went back to my parents' house. After explaining the bizarre ordeal, they surprisingly welcomed me back with open arms. A month later, I moved out again, but my relationship with them improved. If you're considering moving in with a stranger, trust your instincts and be cautious. You never know what you're walking into. If these stories gave you chills, make sure to hit that like button and share them with someone who loves a good scare. What would you do if you found yourself in one of these situations? Let us know in the comments, we'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling tales. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.